Hi, everybody. This is Jack Jezreel. I am on the staff of JustFaith Ministries. I was the originator of the JustFaith program and the founder of JustFaith Ministries, and I'm delighted to be with you. Just by way of a little bit more of self-introduction and as a segue to our topic, over the course of my life, I have been a member of a Catholic worker community for 5 years. I have been involved in parish social ministry for 8 to 10 years. I have been connected with some of the most remarkable national and international Catholic agencies that there are. And part of my interest in our topic today is that in the course of witnessing all these really remarkable expressions of Catholic social mission, I have come to the conclusion that one of the most underdeveloped, and in some cases completely undeveloped ideas about how the Church's social mission can be made most effective is actually located in the Catholic parish. And I know that the parish is not the first place that people think of when they think about effective expressions of Catholic social mission, but it's my conclusion that the parish not only could be one of the most potent versions of justice and solidarity and mercy in the world, but it should be. And so just so you understand sort of my bias going into this, I see a remarkable opportunity for the work of peace and justice being located in the Catholic parish. And happily, what's happened over the last several years is that Pope Francis is essentially saying the same thing, and that's what I'd like to explore with you today. So, to get quickly to our topic, Pope Francis, very shortly after he was named Pope, was meeting with a group of Catholic journalists, and they were speaking in Italian, and somebody asked in Italian with words that don't translate perfectly into English, what Pope Francis was up to, and more specifically, what did he intend his papacy to be? And you would have thought that perhaps Pope Francis might have paused for a few moments before answering at length, but in fact, he answered quickly and very briefly. He said, "I would like to complete Vatican II." Now, if you look at a lot of the early writings of Pope Francis as Pope, what you will notice is that he understands Vatican II to have been a moment in the Church's history in which the Holy Spirit was beckoning the Church into some new possibilities. And on one hand, the Church was open and receptive to that invitation. And on the other hand, it was resistant. It was like the wind blowing and you're sort of beckoning the wind and at the same time holding on to a lamppost so that the wind doesn't actually blow you in the direction that it wants to go. And Pope Francis understands the Church as he received it as Pope to be an institution that was still longing to say yes to the beckon of Vatican II. And so we're going to explore a little bit of what that means today. So one way to talk about the transition from Vatican I to Vatican II and the things that have happened and the things that haven't is to, and this is just one approach, I just want to make that clear, this is one way of talking about it, is that Vatican I, as many of us might remember it, now I'm in my 60s, and I'm sure those of you who are as old as I am have some memory of the Church in Vatican I. But for those of us who grew up with some memory and some experience of the Vatican I Church, most of us will remember that the single most used tool by which to educate Catholics about what it meant to be Catholic was a tool that was devised in the 1890s and was used in almost every parish across the United States, right up through in the 1970s. And that, of course, was the Baltimore Catechism. Now, for those of you who are too young to remember the Baltimore Catechism, it was essentially a collection of hundreds of short, pithy questions about all things Catholic, with, quite frankly, short, pithy answers, some of which sufficed and some which probably needed a little bit more explanation. And nevertheless, as a young Catholic at St. Cecilia's Catholic School in Clearwater, Florida, as I was approaching confirmation during my 5th grade, it was part of what we did was to learn the answers to, I don't know if it was all of the questions, but it was a lot of the most seminal questions of the Baltimore Catechism. And one of those really central questions that the Baltimore Catechism asked was essentially, why did Christ found the church? And the answer was given in a very easy to remember 3 infinitive phrase, to teach, to govern, to sanctify, and the rest of the answer went, and to save all men. And what's interesting about this question, why did Christ institute the church, is that implicit in the question is, what is the church for? What does the church do? Even connected to that, what is the ministry of the church? It's in some ways it's all part of that, the landscape of that question. And so what I think a lot of theologians would tell you is that the difference between Vatican I and Vatican II is really defined by how 2 questions related to this definition are played out. And the first question that, in effect, Vatican II asks Vatican I, or at least approaches Vatican I in answering it a different way, is the question, if the work of the church is to teach, govern, and sanctify, then who are the agents of that activity? In other words, those 3 infinitives, 3 verbs, describe what the church is to do. And who are the doers of that work? And of course, as you look at that definition, and those of you, again, who are old enough to remember the experience of church, the agents of ministry, the ministers, the people who did the work of the church, essentially were clergy, right? And by the way, just to be clear, this is in no way, shape, or form a critique of clergy. In fact, the work of clergy in so many ways during that period was extraordinary. And so, but the reality was that that clergy were the agents of how ministry was understood. And in fact, just to kind of put an underscore and emphasize the point, when I was at the University of Notre Dame getting my Master of Divinity degree from 1979 to 1982, one of the burning questions at the time was there such a thing as lay ministry? Was that an acceptable phrase? Because the hunch was ministry was done by clergy, lay people did something else, but it wasn't called ministry. And so the answer that Vatican II gave to the clergy. Now here's the problem in the eyes of Vatican II. If less than 1% of what we call the Catholic Church, that is the clergy, if less than 1% of the clergy are doing ministry, what is the rest of the church doing? And one way to answer the question is that the other 99 point whatever percent of the church are those actually being ministered to. Now, again, there's really no problem with that because we all need to be ministered to. The problem is if that's the only definition of how faith defines you, then your role is essentially passive. That is, you're not an agent of the church's work, you're a recipient of the church's work. Now, Vatican II comes up with a very different answer to this question. In the answer to who ministers, agents of ministry are not understood just to be those who have experienced the sacrament of holy orders, but those who've experienced the sacrament of baptism. In other words, Vatican II's answer to the question, who ministers, is everybody. Everybody is called to follow Jesus. Everybody is called to do the work of the gospel. Everybody is called to an active life of faith, which is described in part by the language of ministry. Now, here's the really happy news. If you look at the church in the 1960s, about the time of the Second Vatican Council, and then you look at a church today in the 2020s, one of the things you'll discover, as I have all across the country in my travels, is that if you were to have picked up a bulletin from the church in the 1960s, in most places, you would have found something like a single piece of paper folded in half. On the front cover, there would have been, sort of a graphic of the church, maybe, and then some mass times and so forth. On the back, there would have been some advertising, and in the middle, maybe about a page of what's happening in the parish that week. And it would have included daily mass times and when you could go to confession and when the altar society was meeting and maybe a handful of other things. Today, in my experience of traveling around the country, it's not uncommon at all to pick up a Sunday bulletin and for it to look like and I'm of course exaggerating here, the Sunday edition of the New York Times. I mean, it's thick. It takes an hour to read it from cover to cover. There's a lot going on. And in fact, in some of these bulletins that you can find at parishes these days, you'll find, and I do not exaggerate, 200 ministries happening at that parish, all kinds of things going on at the parish. And here's the exciting news, that a lot of those ministries were started by lay people. They're populated by lay people. The engines of them going on are lay people. And this is an associated observation that it's now not uncommon at all for me to travel to some parish to do a mission or a presentation or a talk. And when I ask, about what's happening at the parish, they'll talk about, well, we're in the middle of a building campaign. Well, that's not unfamiliar, is it? We're all used to building campaigns to build larger worship spaces or to build new schools. But interestingly, now more often than not, those building campaigns are about about building a larger community center to accommodate the number of groups that are actually meeting on parish property. In other words, there has been a sizable increase in the number of ministries being done at the parish, and that's just reflective of the fact of this Vatican II emphasis that everybody is called to ministry, everybody's called to be engaged, and parishes, I think, have responded remarkably in so many places. So far, so good. But here's a place where Vatican II has been not so widely embraced. There's a second question that Vatican II asks Vatican I. And the second question is not about who does the ministry, it's actually a question about geography, specifically where does this ministry of teaching, governing, and sanctifying actually happen? And the answer, according to Vatican I, is on parish property. In other words, when you think about these three infinitives, teaching, governing, and sanctifying, and where they specifically happened, the answer was really on parish property. And I can only refer you to my memory of being a 10-year-old boy at a Catholic parish. And on a Sunday morning, for example, my life looked like this. All of us kids would hop into the station wagon. The drive to the church was one of the familiar experiences of pandemonium and chaos and tumult, with all kinds of kids in the back of a station wagon with no seatbelts, among other things. And while that chaos and ruckus would happen all the way to church property, the minute that the right front tire touched the church parking lot, all of us kids immediately were quiet, put our hands on our lap, and behaved ever so obediently, because we all went to St. Cecilia's Catholic School. We all were taught by the sisters there, and we all knew exactly what we were supposed to do when we arrived at church. So we got out of the car, we marched single file to the front doors of the church, we pushed the door open, and as a young 10-year-old, I was always delighted to walk into the space with these stained glass windows and sort of the magic of light in that space. And then, of course, as Mass unfolded, there was this phenomenon of speaking in a language that I did not know and did not understand, but I knew exactly why we were using Latin, of course, and then this is the mind of a 10-year-old. It was because God only speaks Latin. And if we want to talk to God, we have to speak Latin. And then, of course, there were the strange things called kneelers. And of course, there were no kneelers anywhere in the world except at church on the parish block. And then, of course, on the parish block, there were all kinds of men and women who only wore black. Of course, I'm talking about priests and nuns. And we never saw them anywhere except for the school, which was on parish property, and at church, which was on parish property. And so as a young boy who grew up Catholic, I was pretty aware. I thought I was very, very sure that anybody who was really interested in God was going to have to spend a lot of time on parish property. And as a young boy who thought he might want to be a priest, I was pretty sure where I would spend most of my time. After Mass, all of us would walk single file back to the car, and we were quiet until, of course, the right front tire of the car touched the road, and then it was back to the tumult and chaos of our ordinary lives. And my friends, here's the observation I just want to make, is that we, as a Catholic family, our Catholicism was really defined by that hour or so at church on Sunday. We didn't pray as a family off campus. We didn't have kneelers. We didn't have stained glass windows. There were never men or women wearing black who lived in our life. The rest of my life, for the other 6 days and 23 hours, was lived in quote unquote normal time, while church was that time, an hour that happened on Sunday morning. And that's really the point. You see, the answer that Vatican II gives to the question, where does ministry happen, is a different answer, and that the answer is everywhere. And I think one of the best indicators of that answer is given during liturgy, actually, that near the end of liturgy, there is this really theologically and spiritually powerful word, and that word is go. Not go because we're done praying. It's not go because we prayed enough. It's not go because it's time for us to vacuum the floors. It's go, in the name of our God that has gathered us here, go in peace to love and serve God and one another. It's a commissioning rite, right? It's part of the sending rite. And it's basically saying, now that we have gathered here and celebrated the presence of the body of Christ in our midst, it's time for us as a community of faith to be about engaging the world. And of course, the language of engagement necessarily changes when the answer to the question of where do we minister everywhere becomes the answer. Because as we leave the church space and head out the doors, the world that we go to, of course, is a world of family. It's the world of the station wagon. It's also a world of neighborhood. It's a world of economics. It's a world of politics. It's a world that includes not only the people that I see, but all human beings. What our faith makes so perfectly clear is that everybody is our sister and brother. And what Vatican II makes clear is that their joys and their wounds are our concern. And so as we pause at the exit door to consider what ministry might look like, where we go to, and what the gospel means in that context, we consider the reality that roughly 1 billion people on this planet live on less than $2 a day. We consider the prospect that human trafficking has become one of the largest industries in the world. We consider the prospect of climate change, in which the planet itself is threatened. We consider the fact that in the United States of America, arguably the richest country in the world, 1 in 6 children live with food insecurity, not sure they're going to eat the next day. And of course, the list goes on and on. You only need to pick up the newspaper and read the headlines or read the first 10 pages to see the kind of world that we go to. And so the answer to the question, of where does ministry take place not only has a different geography, but it actually changes the answer. So ministry is not just teaching, governing, and sanctifying. Ministry has a wider and deeper connection than even those three infinitive phrases. So what Pope Francis then is hoping for is not only a church in which everybody is engaged, but engaged everywhere. And let me just return for a moment to the picture of that parish bulletin that was so thick and fat with ministries. Here's the challenge, I think, still going forward, and that is in those parishes so active, where there's a beehive of activity, where there are 200 ministries happening. If you were to ask the question, what is the focus of most of those ministries? Wouldn't be surprised if 95% of them were dedicated to things that were happening at the parish, to the people who were part of the parish. In other words, most of that activity is still focused on parish property. And so Francis's hope is that this beehive of activity is not only dedicated to the people who compose the parish, but that it's focused and dedicated to the world beyond. And so what I'd like to do next is draw from the Pope's apostolic exhortation entitled Evangelii Gaudium, which for my money is still one of the most provocative of the Pope's writings. And in it, he addresses the changes in the parish that he'd like to see. And so these are 5 quotes from Evangelii Gaudium, and I'll read them with you. First, I want to emphasize that what I'm trying to express here has a programmatic significance and important consequences. I hope that all communities will devote the necessary effort to advancing along the path of a pastoral and missionary conversion, which cannot leave things as they presently are. Emphasis mine. The first thing I'll point out about this is that the Pope in this document doesn't wish that it just becomes part of the stack of papal statements that have been issued through time. He says here he would like it to actually have programmatic significance. In other words, practical significance in the local church. There are consequences to what he has to say here, which is really significant. The Pope was hoping people would pay attention and they'd actually follow through. But the point that I really want to emphasize here, because in this document, Evangelii Gaudium, and well beyond the document in the Pope's vocabulary and language, he tends to put a lot of emphasis on this word missionary, with the language of mission, missionary, or missional. And in this document, that word shows up more than any other word in the document. And one of his favorite descriptions of the church is a community of missionary disciples. He loves that phrase, and quite frankly, so do I. But here's what's important. The word missionary is a somewhat elastic word that, depending upon who's talking, can mean a lot of different things. But for a South American Jesuit, it really does mean something rather distinctive and which has extraordinary implications for the larger church. So for Francis, the language of missionary or missionary disciples begins, not surprisingly, with movement, but the movement presumes something. So you can look at my screen for just a moment. If you can imagine, if you will, the beginning of the missionary moment begins with somebody who's had the grace, the good fortune, the luck, the blessing of having been nourished and nurtured as a young person into adulthood. In other words, the hope for us all, and the sense where the missionary drama begins, is in the life of somebody who has been nourished by love, who as a child nourished by parents, nourished by neighbors, nourished by community, nourished by school, is brought up in love and reaches a kind of human wholeness, adulthood, We could even maybe call it holiness, in which there is this sense of self-possession and maturity. That's where it begins. And there's two kind of tugs, essentially, says Francis, in that experience. Number one is a sense of belonging. So these are my people. This is my place. I love my community. I'm committed to it. Oh, that's one. But there's also a second dynamic, says Francis, and that is in some ways the obligations of love. It's the prompt of love. And the missionary moment begins with the recognition of that prompt, in which love speaks to a kind of breadth and energy and vitality that moves beyond the protective security and comfort of that loving environment. And so the missionary moment begins when somebody looks around and in effect says, I have to leave here. And they actually leave the place of nurture and find themselves drawn into another context, another community, another place where people are. And the getting up and moving is not prompted by some random urge to travel. It's not reckless, and it's not without very, very significant moorings. If you will, the compass, the spiritual compass that moves people from the place of security to another place is actually, we think, the same compass that inspired the steps and the geography of Jesus. Now, it's the compass of who is without the same experience of love and nurture that I have received. In Catholic social teaching, and what has become common in the Catholic lexicon, is the language of the option for the poor. It's sometimes described as a preferential option for the poor. Pope Benedict liked the preferential love for the poor. And it's not just, for example, an ethical category of saying that the church has an obligation to those who've been left behind. It's actually a description of the human heart. It's a description of God's Spirit. It's a description in some ways of the Holy Spirit, that when our hearts are large and our eyes are open and there's an openness and embrace of God's invitation, what we find ourselves is we're naturally, fundamentally inclined to try to pay attention to our sisters and brothers who are in harm's way, who have been abandoned. And that sightedness, that notice then draws us physically into a journey of engagement in and with those communities that have found themselves dispossessed or abandoned or exploited or whatever the case might be. And so the missionary impulse is really driven by, where does love go? When love is large, where does love take us? And it doesn't mean we push away or eschew the community that nourished us into existence. It simply speaks to the fact that, if you will, our people, our love, our engagement transcends that community of nurture and now begins to take in a wider sense of God's people and draws us by the force of love's preference, if you will, into that relationship. And I just mean it this way, that, as a parent, and this is a simple way of describing it, my wife Maggie and I had 3 daughters, and we loved all of our daughters, of course. When one of them experienced hardship or crisis or illness, our attention naturally went to the daughter who was sick. It's not that we loved our other 2 daughters any less at that moment. It's just that the daughter in crisis, the daughter who was not well, is the one who then tugs at us and draws us near. Similarly, when we begin to recognize that God's world is the whole world and that all people are our people, then while we continue to love those who have loved us, our attention gets drawn to the ones who've been left behind. And so this notion of missionary conversion, it honors that tug of love's and the Spirit's pull. Now, one more thing. When we make this transition, when we hear, for example, the voices of the poor and the powerless, we make ourselves available by being with. We don't come with predetermined answers. It's not like, I'm here to save you because I have money and I have schooling and I have wisdom, or whatever the case might be. That's not what we do. People have done that. I have done that. It does so much damage, and let us not do that again. We go essentially, basically just offering a sense of our presence, friendship, accompaniment, with an openness to learning, with a willingness to listen, with an interest in building bridges, but not with answers that solve problems that people have, at least not in advance. I go to be present. And here's what this is where Francis describes this remarkable thing called encounter, or encuentro, as it's so often described. And that is in that experience of being with, all kinds of great things can happen. Now, to me, I am so often changed by the encounter in the relationship with people whose experiences are so potentially so very different than my own, in the experience of witnessing life lived through a different reality, in the experience of, as Francis might describe it, in the experience of being with our sisters and brothers who have experienced vulnerability and fragility and exploitation. I am changed. I become a different person by the experience of being pulled into compassion. And in that experience of compassion, bonds are built, relationships can happen, and in those relationships, solidarity, and out of solidarity, the prospect of justice. And so this notion of encuentro or encounter really speaks to the importance of all of us moving from the places where we're comfortable, secure, protected, and safe into places where our sisters and brothers are experiencing neglect, hardship, abandonment, exploitation, and it's seeing life through the lens that they experience it. In the context of that, new things can happen individually, and new things can happen collectively and socially. And we hope the reign of God in my life, the reign of God in the world. So let's move on. Pope Francis goes on to say, I dream of a missionary option, that is a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything, again, my emphasis, so that the church's customs, ways of doing things, times and schedules, language and structures can be suitably channeled for the evangelization of today's world rather than for her self-preservation. Again, notice at the end here the Pope's concern that the church become self-preoccupied, that the church, if you will, stay preoccupied. And he imagines this missionary possibility to have the necessary effect of, and again, I'll just repeat it, transforming everything. What's not included in everything? That's a trick question. So that everything that happens, if you will, at the local church, its customs, the ways of doing things, like what doesn't that include? Everything about church changes because now we're focused on how do we become a church that is essentially a missional church, a church of missionary disciples. Let me go on. The renewal of structure, says Pope Francis, demanded by pastoral conversion can only be understood in this light, as part of an effort to make them more mission-oriented, to make ordinary pastoral activity on every level more inclusive and open, to inspire in pastoral workers a constant desire to go forth, and in this way to elicit a positive response from all those whom Jesus summons to lead a friendship with him. As John Paul II once said to the bishops of Oceania, all renewal in the church must have mission as its goal if it is not to fall prey to a kind of ecclesial introversion. I don't think I've ever seen those two words put together like that, ecclesial introversion. Again, the Pope has the worry that the church becomes self-preoccupied, that the church is limited and in some ways kind of frightened. And in contrast to that, we have this mission-oriented option. What I love about this particular text is how it begins, the renewal of structures. Now, the reason I bring this up, my friends, is that a lot of times when we've talked about the missionary option, and I'm thinking again back to my, Vatican I experience and life and memory, and even its legacy as it's continued to this day, is oftentimes during the prayers of petition, we'll pray for vocations. We'll pray for people to become missionaries. And I think the way we think about some of these things, including the missionary option, is that it's sort of a specialized Green Beret version, if you will, of Christianity, that it's really only intended for a small number of people, and that what we as a community are doing is hoping and praying that that small number of people recognize who they are and get on with it because we need them. And I think Francis understands this to be a call that's intended for everyone. I think in some ways, Pope Francis understands the missionary call in a sort of democratic way in which everybody is called to missionary discipleship in the same way that everybody is called to communion, to Eucharistic celebration. It's intended for everyone. And so when we talk about the renewal of structures, what we're talking about is how does a parish, for example, organize itself so that it invites, empowers, and commissions every single member of the parish to be engaged in missionary activity. That the renewal of structures required here is a kind of rethinking of all things parish, so that the minute a child, for example, is baptized into the church, from that moment on, there is a constant drumbeat of beckon, invitation, and empowerment for that child to become the kind of person who will be willing, interested, motivated, passionate about engaging with the world's wounds and being a person who seeks relationships in the most abandoned places as part of what it means to be a baptized Catholic, period. And so this notion of renewal of structures is just really so compelling. On to the next quote. Now the Pope here is trying to say, look, I'm looking for a new thing, but I'm not abandoning the parish. He writes, the parish is not an outdated institution, precisely because it possesses great flexibility. It can assume quite different contours depending upon the openness and missionary creativity of the pastor and the community, again, emphasis mine, while certainly not the only institution which evangelizes. If it proves capable of self-renewal and constant adaptivity, it continues to be the church living in the midst of the homes of her sons and daughters. This presumes that it really is in contact with the homes and lives of its people and does not become a useless structure out of touch with people or a self-absorbed cluster made up of a chosen few. Again, notice again how this quote ends with sort of a warning about what the church can't be, right? It can't be out of touch. It can't be the group of people who are looking at each other and say, isn't it great to be saved and to be together and away from the rabble of the rest of the world. What I find so compelling about this particular text really begins near the top. Let's just look at some of the words in this text. So on the second line, there is this word flexibility. And then near the end of this line, quite different contours. And then we get to the word openness, and below that, creativity. And then we bounce down a little bit further. There's self-renewal and adaptivity. And you can't come to any other conclusion except the Pope is hoping something will change here. And not only is he hoping it will change, he is essentially commissioning parishes to experiment with what does it mean to become a different kind of place where missionary activity is the focus and not something else. This is really just an extraordinary invitation for pastors and their communities to be rethinking what does it mean to be the local parish, with a focus on how do we be light and leaven to the world. And of course, the vocabulary that evolves from this is the vocabulary of accompaniment. It's the vocabulary of compassion and charity and mercy and solidarity and justice. And that's what evolves out of the language of missionary discipleship and encuentro, or encounter. And finally, we must admit that the call to review and renew our parishes, and he's thinking here of Vatican II, has not yet sufficed to bring them nearer to people, to make them environments of living communion and participation, and to make them somewhat mission-oriented. I'm sorry, I read that wrong. Mostly mission-oriented. Oh, wait a minute. Completely mission-oriented. Let me just emphasize that. Completely mission-oriented. And again, just for emphasis, completely. And if you're not familiar with that word, wholly, entirely, totally mission-oriented parish. Wow. I mean, it's just a stunning possibility, and one that I think would remarkably re-energize our church. So with Francis' invitation to be creative, I'd like to offer you some possibilities from the mind of Jack about what mission-oriented church might look like. And what I'd like to do as my shift language is not to say instead of that, then this, but from what we have known in our church to something that adds to it. In other words, we don't want to toss out the best, the wisdom, and the legacy of Vatican I. We want to add to it. And here's what happens. If you add something to something, it changes the whole thing. It's not like just adding increases mathematically, but there's actually a kind of alchemy, a chemistry, that by adding the second thing, you change the first thing. And so in the spirit of that, let me go to my first observation. From how do we equip people to be part of the sanctuary or the gathering place? We know Vatican I really emphasized sacrament, prayer, obviously liturgy, and a sense of community in the community. All that is absolutely fabulous. And what it was missing is what we'd like to add. How to equip people to be agents of ministry to the entire world, and in so doing become healers and if you will, transformers of the world. And then the language of ministry takes on the words of mission, justice, mercy, and advocacy. And by virtue of the alchemy of what Vatican I emphasized and what Vatican II is trying to emphasize, we end up not only adding the language of mission, justice, and mercy, but we end up impacting the potency and the flavor of sacraments, community, and prayer. Prayer necessarily changes because what we are doing with our lives has changed. And so what prayer needs to be about, I think, becomes defined by what we're actually doing with our lives in the name of our faith. Next slide. From religious education, focused on life on church property, primarily sacramental life, right? So much of religious education is also defined as sacramental prep. What I'd like to see us think about in terms of this transition to Vatican II is religious education focused on human and global realities, and Pope Francis gave us a beautiful example with his encyclical Laudato Si, focused on climate change and the environment. And then the church's response in the light and hope of faith. So religious education continues to hold high the life on parish property and sacramental life and prayer and so forth, but also when people come out of, for example, some kind of catechesis, when people come out of any kind of religious education program, when people come out of a Catholic grade school, a Catholic high school, a Catholic college, or any kind of ministry preparation, they not only know a lot about, if you will, sacraments, Bible, and church, but they also know a lot about the world. They know something about human trafficking. They know something about human deprivation. They know about global hunger, domestic hunger. They know something about climate change, and they know it's the relationship to their faith tradition. From the parish as a place of pastoral care of its members, which, gosh, it's great, right? I mean, how many of us have known the experience of getting sick, or somebody in our family getting sick, and then 28 people from our parish showing up with casseroles, which is a lovely thing, right? It's a wonderful thing. To also the parish as a place of prophetic urgency for the poor and vulnerable who may or may not be part of the parish or neighborhood. In other words, our sense of who our people are grows from just who is inside parish boundaries or who shows up on a Sunday at our liturgies, but the sense that everybody is my sister and brother, and I have a particular inclination and responsibility to those who are most at risk, and that I have this sense of, and I've used the word here, prophetic urgency, that this is something that has a claim on me, and there's a sense of emergency connected to it. From parish renewal, emphasizing belonging to a place or a people, right now, I think a lot of you are familiar with any number of so-called parish renewal programs that you can purchase to, of course, renew your parish. And I think they do a good job of emphasizing how to make people feel like they belong, and it's a strong sense of how to do better the things we've done. My worry, and quite frankly, my critique of so many of these parish renewal programs, is they just do the same thing with added gusto, instead of, I think, paying attention to Pope Francis and his interest in a community of missionary disciples. So what I'd like to add, going down to the bottom of this slide, church renewal emphasizing empowerment to transcend the familiar and the comfortable, to be missional. In other words, as I was describing earlier, the sense that when you're in a place that's genuinely nourishing you, a place that's genuinely drawing you into love, with love, the natural inclination is going to be, how do I be attentive to those for whom love has been obstructed, which essentially is another way of describing hunger or human trafficking or whatever, where love has been impeded. And how to be a people, how to be a church, how to be a community that's driven by that emphasis. On we go. Evangelization as a way of getting people to the sanctuary to be with us Catholics. And again, there's nothing at all wrong about the invitation to our sisters and brothers to join us in a community of faith that we find life-giving and vibrant and energizing and so forth. But evangelization also has to be a way, if you go to the bottom of the slide, engaging people in the missional geography of Jesus and the active care of Jesus. In other words, when we invite people to be a part of our community of faith, are we inviting them to Jesus? Are we inviting them to the gospel? Because who was Jesus and who was the gospel? It necessarily includes this care, this active care, energized by the Holy Spirit, that finds itself constantly paying attention, like, Mother Teresa, driven by a love for those who are wounded and in crisis and whose lives have been reduced by some kind of deprivation and neglect. And so I think about when Jesus was calling the disciples, he doesn't say, hey, come over here, let's gather around a table and talk for a few months, and when you're ready, we'll get on the road. Jesus, almost from the moment that he invites any one of the disciples, immediately engages them on the road. They're immediately traveling together, and Jesus is ministering to people, and the disciples ask questions really like, why are you doing that? And then in the context of the doing, Jesus explains. To me, that's the most compelling kind of evangelization or religious education or spiritual formation. It's the formation that happens in the give and take of conversation and actually doing something. And I think that's the model for evangelization and spiritual formation and religious education that I think has been way underdeveloped in our community of faith. Think about this, church going. When somebody asks about church going, they usually meant, where are you going to church? Or what block in the city do you go to for church? And that's fine. And that's perfectly usable and useful. But the notion of church going that I'd like to emphasize is the notion of where is the church going? In other words, just imagine this as a scenario. The pastor stands up in front of the community after communion and then basically says, so my sisters and brothers, where is the church going this week? And in response to the question, maybe somebody raises their hand and says, well, Father, as you may know, every last Tuesday of the month, there's a team of about 20 of us that go to St. Vincent de Paul. We work at the soup kitchen. That's where we're going this week. And the community applauds and commissions them. And then somebody else stands up and says, Father, as you know, every Wednesday, there's a team of 5 of us who go to the prison. And we'll be going again this Wednesday. And the community celebrates that with applause and a commission. And somebody else says, Father, I'll be going by myself, but there's somebody in our neighborhood who is sick with cancer. I'll be going there every day this week, and the community commissions and celebrates that, and so it goes. Where is the church going this week? Prayer and discernment in the sanctuary. We, of course, so many of our models of when people are praying happens, in a church building, and that's perfectly appropriate. And a lot of times we're praying about, what do I do about such and such and such and such, and that's perfectly fine. But there's also another way of thinking about the relationship between prayer and discernment. That's not just being quiet. Sometimes prayer and discernment is prompted by action. Sometimes prayer and discernment is prompted by where we actually put ourselves. I'm thinking again about, the missionary movement and what happens when we move from here to here. What kind of prayers happen in the context of actually having placed ourselves in a different environment? Just to make a very obvious, to provide a very obvious example, many years ago, one of my friends in Oakland, California, invited me to walk with her and her bishop in a neighborhood that had experienced some drive-by shootings. And the purpose of the walk was nothing more than to let people know that we were thinking of them, praying for them, that we were for them. We had signs that said, we are with you, we love you. And our whole purpose was just to be there. And as we walked, of course, it was in a community that was, in such, rough shape. It's a community where, so much of commerce and industry had left behind. It was sort of a shell of itself. Every other house was boarded up. The sidewalks were broken and crumbling. It was a community that had basically just been abandoned, except for the people who lived there. And I remember thinking to myself, if any human being who's walking here got on their knees and just said, gracious God, what would you have me do? One of the answers that would have been so immediate is, the response, help me make this whole again. Whenever we put ourselves in a place where there is human crisis, the Holy Spirit's almost immediate answer is, help me make this whole again. Help me restore this to human flourishing instead of human crisis and deprivation. And so many times our work on the streets can inspire the answers to the prayers that we ask. Next slide, the assumption that people move from prayer to action. That's true but it's also true that people move from action to prayer. I've seen this so many times in conversations with people as they have engaged deeper and deeper in the work of compassion, the work of encounter, the work of seeking justice. And gosh, the hardships, the struggle, the challenges related to trying to repair some of the wounds of the world really just completely alter the way we think about prayer, alter the things that we pray for, alter our need for the kinds of resources that will deepen our prayer experience and deepen the well of spirituality that we draw from. So it's so critical that we understand that relationship between prayer and action is actually a two-way street. We move from membership, and again, let me just remind us all, membership is a good thing. To think about belonging to a place, to be a member of St. Cecilia's Catholic Church, which I grew up in. To be a member there meant I had relationships, that this was where I belonged, that it gave me some sense of identity and a place to call my own. All that's good stuff. And then I think what Vatican II is asking us is to think about membership tied to discipleship. I've labeled these two as sanctuary activities and road activities, and it just sets up a question. And I'll set up the question by just sharing a little story about two women, one of whom I knew very well and one whom I knew by virtue of her media presence. The first woman was my mom. When my mom married my dad, she became Catholic. And when she was told what that meant to be a member of the Catholic Church, she was told something like this, that as a Catholic, you must be at Mass every Sunday. But if you're a really good Catholic, you'll come to Mass every day. And she was told if you want to be Catholic, then you need to come to penance, or you need to come to confession, she was told, every 3 months or so. But if you're a really good Catholic, you'll come every month. And of course, the invitation was to the parish, to the sanctuary. And that kind of invitation to be a part of the church's activities at the church continued. If you want to be a really good Catholic, then you'll become part of the altar society. And, again, the focus was on the block called parish. If we contrast that with another woman, I'm thinking here of Mother Teresa, whose discipleship, whose Catholic identity was literally connected to the road, right? She actually ministered to dying poor people on the streets of Calcutta, and then of course her ministry expanded to other cities around the world. But literally, her ministry took place on the road. Now, here's the question, and of course I've set it up to have the answer that I want. I admit that. If you look at the gospel, and you look at Jesus, and you read all the text connected to Jesus, and you were to ask this question, was Jesus a sanctuary guy, or was Jesus a road guy? There's only one answer. He's on the road all the time, and his disciples are constantly on the road, encountering people who have needs and trying to address their needs and inviting people into that kind of life. Leadership. We've thought about ministry, priesthood, parish leadership as the caretakers of people on the church block. And that's a good thing, right? When somebody's mom gets sick, the priest or some staff member shows up, that's a lovely thing. But also leadership as the caretaker of God's world and the leader of a small group of people called the parish who love and heal it. In other words, in this context, leadership of the church, bishop, priests, parish staff, whatever, lay leadership, are about the orchestra leaders. They're the people who bring together the community to say, here's what we think needs to be done, and how are we going to do it, right? Here's the work that has to happen in God's world, and we as the parish of, St. Mary's Catholic Church are called to take our part in it and do what we can. And leadership gets defined by the pastor, if you will, not only leading the people who gather on the parish block, but then actually lead them off of the parish block to be light and leaven to the world. Quick summary phrases. The parish as a hangout. I still want to belong to some place. I still want to be a part of some people. But to also the parish as a launching pad. The parish should be understood as the place that not only loves us, but then in effect prepares us for the, if you will, off-campus work that needs to be done. You know, I'm always tickled when I have the opportunity to travel to New York, White Plains, New York, Maryknoll, New York, and to rub elbows with some of the fathers and brothers and nuns who have committed their lives. You know, the story goes something like this. Frank, who grew up in Baltimore, somehow finds his way to Maryknoll. He's prepared, he's ordained, and he's sent, and he spends the next 50 years in Kenya, for example, and only comes back to the United States because his community mandates it. And all he can do is talk about his experience and how much he loved it, of having been sent to a different place where he encountered people who lived very differently and, quite frankly, very much poorer than he ever could have imagined, and is changed by the experience. And in some ways, that's just one version, a big version of what this missional nurture looks like. This is a church. Our Catholic Church created this thing called, Maryknoll, which then becomes a place that continues to inspire and ready and commission people to be connected to all parts of the world that need attention. This year of mercy that we have experienced under the time of Pope Francis's tenure, it should include the study of mercy. I actually read that there were a number of people who are getting PhDs who actually ended up doing their PhD on mercy. I'm sure the Pope was pleased. And I understand that there were hundreds of parishes that actually studied mercy as part of their curriculum during that year of mercy. I'm sure the Pope was pleased. But at the end of the day, I think what the Pope is hoping for is that with all that study of mercy, with our attention to Bible study, with our attention to catechesis, at the end of the day, what it leads to, what it climaxes with, or what it's accompanied by, is the practice of mercy. And my sisters and brothers, isn't it a delightful thing that we are led in the church in 2020 by a man who continues to put himself in a place where he can be changed, where there is encounter, his continuing beckon to the parish to be a place of healing, to be a place of compassion, to be a place that's constantly being drawn into connection with our sisters and brothers, both who are experiencing joy or wounds, but that we become that kind of people. And that is the church that Pope Francis is hoping for, and that's the church that I think we have to look forward to. That's the church worth living for and working for and sacrificing for, and ultimately really dying for. It's a vision so compelling, a vision I think that would draw young people and all people, life-giving opportunity, an opportunity that gives life to the individual, to each one of us, but also brings life to the world. Thank you all for listening, and I hope that the rest of your experience of the conference goes well. God bless.